Hey, hi, I'm Krish. I'm a product manager. And today we'll be practicing a product sense interview question. So let's get into it. So the question is, Meta is considering stepping into the real estate business to facilitate buying and selling of houses. Can you design a product manager? Sure. So typically, before even getting started, I often try to get a framework in my mind. In this case, I'd be referring to a framework shared by one of the product leaders, Harshal Patil, who is also a friend of mine. And I'll link the description in the chat box below for the blog where he mentions this. So we start with clarifying the situation, then we'll get into who are the users, what are the user needs, identifying gaps in existing solutions versus where can we differentiate by identifying feature improvements. From there, we'll go into execution plan, time permitting, go-to-market metrics, and trade-offs. So to begin with, clarifying the situation. I'll often ask the interviewers a question around like, why is Meta considering getting into the situation? Why now? Is there any geographical conditions which are going to sort of like matter in this case? So to begin with, this is some of the features which I look at. What is the total addressable market in this situation? Let's make an assumption that we are going to start with the North American market, where the overall industry of selling and buying houses is really good, and companies do make a lot of like efforts there. In terms of growth, more and more young professionals are willing and taking a smart choice to buy a home in the current market, even though the market is sort of like crazy given the real estate and the interest rates where we are in. Um, they're making a smart choice and an investment in their future, and not paying the rent. So the market is pretty upward and trending. And some of the macroeconomic conditions, which we just talked about, right? But considering that we have been asked to design an app, these questions are sort of like irrelevant in this case. Speaking of competitors, I can think of Redfin and Zillow, who are primarily a leader in this place and sort of like widely used across multiple different states and cities. So that's sort of like framing up the why situation. Now, just thinking about in a minute, like what are the strengths Meta can bring? Looking at Meta's vision, which is like, connecting the world globally. Um, I think Meta has a couple different strong pillars in this situation, which is going to really help Meta be a leader in this place. Right from the marketplace to the technical ability to extending these different capabilities spread across multiple different geographical locations, are all strength. Meta also has the budget and the resourcing needed to build something like this, and they have sort of like that rigor to try out something new in the market, and go from there. So those are some of these strengths. In terms of risk, being a net new opportunity in the market, we can always roll back, and the risk is of not getting adoption. At that point in time, we can sort of like continue experimenting and finding the niche in the scales market until we sort of like find something which is working out for us, right? Cool. So now that we have a clarification around like, the why and why are we trying to build this, let's get into the next section, which is sort of like identifying who are the users in this space, right? Um, and typically, I would again start with identifying these users. But in this case, I want to take 1 minute trying to identify, what is the value chain before I even get into the users, right? So a value chain is nothing but, what does the end-to-end flow look like when someone is considering buying a home, right? And thinking about value chain in the house buying market, there are a couple key um, personas or users, right? So one is agents. Agents are someone who facilitate, buying and selling. In many conditions, they are also sort of like the middle person who is going to sort of like facilitate a lot of discussions and viewings and all these different things. Seller is someone who is looking to sell their properties. Again, there are a lot of like pain points. We'll get into those. Buyer is someone who is looking to buy a property. They have a certain budget in mind. They have a certain neighborhood in mind. And they need to make sure that the property they are buying is seamless and go from there. Escrow is a third party sort of like company which helps facilitate all these financial transactions, making sure that they are all legit. Banking professionals get involved in the stage of like contract where you're trying to identify um, where do I get a mortgage loan and applying to multiple different places. And then finally, there's a lot of like third party vendor integrations, getting the inspection done, getting the staging done, doing repair work, and all sorts of different things. So that's sort of like a value chain before a house is successfully closed, which in that terms means that the deal has completed in itself. So looking at these value chain, we have identified a couple different users, right? Let's look at these three main user segments which we have so far, which is the agents, the sellers, and the buyers. Thinking about some of these user needs or the gaps which there are in the current situation, right? As I mentioned, agents are someone who are facilitating these transactions. They are also helping customers, with the viewing, listing, connecting with vendors, and all of that, right? Agents operate at a certain percentage of the overall sale value. Typically, it's between 3 to 5% in the US. So that's the commission which agents works on. Today, from their pain points, agents deal with a lot of back and forth. They have to manually get in touch with all these different vendors. They have to physically um, drive to these property showings. Also, as we get into more and more virtual and remote world, typically agents would be referred to by friends and family who have used them in the past, right? But now, as people are moving into these new cities where no one else has lived, where they do not know anyone, even finding an agent is getting more difficult, right? So that's one of the sort of like core issue agents have been noticing, that they've seen gradual down in being able to find new customers, be it for selling or buying. So that really makes it an important and tough for their job. Now, looking at sellers, sellers are, as I mentioned, selling the property. They need to make sure that the buyers are properly vetted so that the deal goes through, it doesn't fall, and they need to make sure that they are dealing with someone who is credible from a buying perspective. Now, from sellers also, as I mentioned, right, they have to deal with a lot of like third parties. They have to deal with tax professionals. They have to deal with agents, and a lot of like these different personas who comes into picture. Again, these are some of the sort of like so finding the sync between these multiple different agents. At the same time, how do you make sure that all these third-party companies are giving you the best price? They typically just reach out to like one or two agents to list the property and then just go with whatever the price for these different vendors, which is being talked about, right? You need someone who is trustworthy, at the same time is going to get you the best deal in the in a given time window. Cool. So that's the seller. Now looking at the buyer, right? So buyer again is someone who is buying a property or just casually looking. They are not sure, what are they exactly looking for, but they have a certain budget and a neighborhood in mind, and they need help with like property showings. They want to make sure that the property is properly inspected, um, that there are no like major repair works or anything is being hidden from the property, right? They also need to make sure that the property is well insured and inspected in terms of like fraud, if the property is not, double mortgage, all these different technical terms to make sure that, they are heading in the right direction. Now, in terms of pain point, again, looking at that value chain, if you see from the buying process, there's a lot overwhelming process. And most of it is disjointed. As a home buyer, I remember when I was first trying to buy a home, it was super painful. Once we did identify, what kind of budget we need to work with, we started looking and we honestly looked for like more than 30 or 40 different houses. We individually toured these houses. So it took a lot of time um, out of like, the viewing these properties. And most of them were even not great because just looking at the pictures, it didn't portray a right image. Second thing, once we did identify, what we do want to buy, the next thing was, finding a mortgage, right? So finding a proper bank who is willing to work with us. So identifying the best interest rate, um, also making sure that they are working within our budget, they are giving us some deals on the closing cost, etc. Next was for again dealing with vendors, moving in, shifting in, making sure that if there are any repair works, making sure that the property is safe to live, making sure that we get the transfers of all the core amenities or like trash, water, so taking care of all the utilities basically. So as you see, overall these are some of the sort of like the user needs versus pain points which we have identified in these three key main personas in the home buying process, right? And one thing which is, coming more and more evidently is that the overall process is sort of like really disjointed. Customers have to, in any given process, right? Customers are sort of like struggling with, yeah. So the process is disjointed, takes a lot of time, needs a lot of coordination. For first-time home buyers, it is an overwhelming process. Cool. So those are some of the gaps at a high level which we identify. Next, what I'll do is, take a minute, typically ask the interviewer to give me a minute or two to identify some of the feature plans, right? Or what are some of, now that we have identified all these key different feature improvements, sorry, all these sort of like pain points, from a feature improvement standpoint, what makes sense? What do we go and build? So I have a couple different ideas where I think we can make a difference, right? So to begin with, Meta being Meta, technically we are super strong in terms of building complicated software products. But where can we sort of like looking at these pain points offer that connection, right? So one thing I think we can do is offer a cohesive end-to-end shopping and buying process. By this, what I mean is, offering a portal which basically connects these different personas by different services. Users can also look for, different vendors. They can look for agents. They can also connect to all these financial mortgage loan companies. One thing, again, I remember during my home buying process was I had to share the same set of documents, which was like a huge pile of documents over and over again with all the different banks I work with to get the best interest rate. And that itself was huge point, right? So creating this portal to facilitate all of that. Second, I think looking at where we are, right? And how do we address the lot of time, taking a lot of time? So Meta has recently entered into this Meta Quest with AR, VR. Um, if I had this, something like this, where I could, sit in my home and look at different properties, check out what they are, experience the living experience. What does it look like being in a house without having to drive there? Is going to be game changing, right? I can put on the goggle and just stream for different properties which I like. I can make sure that, I can also try placing my furniture. I can do a couple different things. I can go into the kitchen, um, pretend that I am cooking. I can try out different timings, evenings, mornings. What does sunset look like? Where does the early sunrise morning heat coming in from? All those different things, which is just not possible by human, right? You have to visit multiple different times to even do that. So this is, I think, going to be a game changer for Meta to be offering in this space. And then finally, I think looking at the marketplace capabilities which Meta has, right? Which is like really great. Marketplace itself, which facilitates selling and buying, already takes care of a lot of complexity, and we need not reinvent the wheel from scratch. So leveraging these key capabilities, right? So these are some of the feature improvements which I think sort of which we can offer. And one last thing which just came to my mind is, Facebook being Facebook. One other thing here is leveraging the network, right? So your first, second, or third circles. So if someone is buying a property, within my first or second or third circles, I still know them. I still have a way to sort of like connect to them, which is just like makes these things much more easier. Again, as I mentioned, like, trust is important in this deal making process. So making sure that, how do we leverage these capabilities to get into the networking capabilities and go from there. So with these feature improvements, obviously we don't have a lot of time on hand. Again, this is one of the other question which I would ask the interviewer before, like, what is their expected timeline to build this. So with that, we need to definitely prioritize to make sure what can we build, which user persona can we prioritize, right? So looking at the users which we identified, agents in this case, seller, and a buyer. Now, in terms of like reach, for this end-to-end application where we are going to offer these couple different features, what is the reach expected for agents? I want to say that the reach for agents is typically going to be low to mid. Agents typically don't like adopting to newer technology faster. Um, you know, they are typically non-tech users. So setting this entire process and making sure that it's flowing through. Agents are still very crucial for them, right? So I'm going to write that, the reach is mid, but the impact is huge. If we get these agents to sort of use this property, which means that they would obviously connect these sellers to this agent itself, to the platform itself, and then, offer these different capabilities. In terms of like underserved, as I mentioned, some of those early pain points which we identified, right? Being able to get new clients is the biggest one. Now, in terms of seller, right, their reach could be huge because as a seller, I'm going to look for like where is the low interest rate being offered, where is the lowest commission being taken. But the impact for that, as I think through, could be low or medium, right? Because um, as a seller, I'm not sure if I want to trust and sign up for a new portal, which has just gotten into the market while I'm also selling my property for the first time. So it's like crucial for me to understand like what exactly needs to happen. I'm not sure of the different processes, right? In terms of like their underserved capabilities, sellers have the need to sell to a properly vetted customer. And then finally, right, so for users, they are typically yet into get into the market. They are not on the fence to pay money upfront. So buyers would have a very huge or significantly huge impact with this portal itself. Um, their impact is going to be huge as well because buyers, as I mentioned, they would obviously be very interested to try out touring a property without having to go there, being able to find out the marketplace capabilities, being able to leverage the network, all of that, right? Um, and Perfect, cool. So with this prioritization framework, I think looking at these couple different data points which we just saw, I think I'm going to prioritize the seller and the buyer persona specifically because of those reasons, right? I know that, for any given property, oh, sorry, I'm going to prioritize the agents and the seller um, user persona. For any given property deal, agents are crucial. Even if we get the agents to, onboard, provide them with a lucrative commission, they would be pretty intrigued to come on board. And as a result, all the customers who are selling the property would tag along with these agents because the agents would help them on board and so forth. And from a buyer, again, we identify a couple different reasons why this is going to be a game changer for the buyer. So we'll go from there. So that's the reason for buyer. Now going back to the framework, right? So speaking a bit around execution plan, and then we'll get into metrics. So from an execution plan, I think again, typically gauge the room, ask the interviewers if they're interested in finding something like this. What I'm going to do is, these features which we talked about, right? So within these features, given the agent and the buyer persona, we will go ahead and prioritize the portal, which is going to be sitting on top of FB Marketplace. The key differentiating factor here is that cohesive user journey. So this makes sure that how do we blend in all different personas in the value chain on the portal, which means, working closely with banking, with repairmans, with tax professionals, with agents, everyone, right? So on the portal, a complete end-to-end journey. And then finally, we also need to make sure that, the AR, the AR/VR feature, which we talked about, so integrate with Meta Quest. This would need upfront investments around making sure that all the properties as they're listed, we have someone to go and shoot the properties, shoot record the properties to get them on the platform and go from there. So these are the features. That's how we would sort of like execute in a particular manner. Now finally, before we close out, looking at the metrics, right? One, I think adoption is going to be a crucial metric. We want to make sure that, not only what is the daily active, weekly active users, but we also need to break it down into what actions are they performing, how many tours have been watched virtually. So I think this metric would give us enough information to make sure that how many properties were listed, how many users signed up as buyers, and then how many tours were watched virtually. The second metric I would potentially look at is the overall sort of the financials, right? So in terms of like market share, because again, as a business, we need to make sure that Facebook is making money out of it, right? Um, so does this mean that, identifying that we charge agents to use our platform, or do we just take a portion of the end-to-end is an important metric here. Cool. So I think we covered a lot. Just to reiterate what we covered, right? So Meta is considering stepping into the real estate business to facilitate buying and selling of houses, how we go about it. We talked about the 9 stages of any given product case. We went into at a high level, why. We talked about the total addressable market. We talked about some of the macroeconomic conditions. We talked about competitors, right? We talked about the overall value chain of what does the process look like. And then we talked about their user needs, their pain point for each of the persona. From there, we identified gaps in the current competitors such as Redfin and Zillow. And then from there, we identified a couple feature improvements or new features, which is going to be sort of like a differentiating factor. From there, we use the prioritization framework to prioritize two different user personas, and then at a high level talked about like how would we go about executing these feature in that sequence. Finally, we briefly touched upon metrics, which is like adoption, daily active users, weekly active users, how many tours have been watched virtually. This is a twofold metric, which would also tell us like, how many buyers signed up and how many properties were listed. I can further break it down as I need. And then finally, market share or profit percentage. What percentage of the market do we have? And how much money are we making on top of it? Cool. So this was a good example. Hopefully it helped you all, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.